There is a baptism register. It is held in a private digital archive in England, and its pages are photographs of a document kept in Calcutta, specifically, the early records of the Armenian Apostolic Church on Armenian Street, one of the oldest Christian congregations in the Indian subcontinent. The register runs from 1793 to 1859. Most of the entries are in a script that requires a specialist to read. One entry, partially legible, records the baptism of a child whose father's parentage is annotated in English, in a different hand, added later, with 2 words, East Indian. I came to this story expecting to dismiss it. I had been told, as many researchers had been told, that the questions surrounding Vivien Leigh's ancestry were the product of gossip, the kind of half-serious speculation that attaches to any beautiful woman who was born somewhere inconvenient and rose very fast. I assumed the record was complete. I assumed the gaps were not gaps at all, just the normal thinning of documentation that happens at the edges of empire. I was wrong about the gaps. I want to say something before we go further, and I want to say it plainly. Vivien Leigh has living descendants. Her daughter Suzanne died in 2015, but Suzanne's 3 sons, her grandchildren, are alive. This script is not about diminishing a legacy. It is not about exposing a secret. It is about understanding what was real, what was hidden, and why the hiding was a perfectly rational response to the world those people lived in. We proceed with that understanding clearly in mind. Remember this name, Yakji. We will come back to it. The answer, when it surfaces, will connect Vivien Leigh's matrilineal ancestry to a community whose erasure from the colonial record was not accidental, and whose invisible presence shaped some of the most famous faces in 20th century Hollywood. The official genealogical record for Vivien Leigh is, on its surface, straightforward. She was born Vivien Mary Hartley on the 5th of November, 1913, on the campus of St. Paul's School in Darjeeling, Bengal Presidency, British India. Her father, Ernest Richard Hartley, was a cavalry officer in the British Indian Army, born in 1882. Most sources place his birth either in Bingley, West Yorkshire, or on the Isle of Islay in Argyll, Scotland. His parents were Joseph Nicholson Hartley and Elizabeth Holgate. The paternal line is English and Scottish. It is well documented. It does not raise questions. The maternal line is where the record becomes interesting. Her mother was Gertrude Mary Frances Yakji, born in Darjeeling in 1888. Gertrude's mother, Vivien Leigh's maternal grandmother, was Mary Teresa Robinson, described consistently in biographies as Irish and devoutly Catholic. This is the line that gave Vivien her religion, her accent for the convent school in Roehampton, and the peach-like complexion that, according to Hugo Vickers's 1988 biography Vivien Leigh, led many people in colonial India to assume Gertrude was simply Irish. Vickers wrote that Gertrude's fair skin encouraged many in the belief she was Irish. That sentence is doing a great deal of work. It is not saying she was Irish. It is saying she was believed to be Irish by people who, in 1910s British India, had excellent social reasons to believe it. Gertrude's father, Vivien's maternal grandfather, was Michael John Yakji. He was listed at his death as a landed proprietor, formerly a station master. He died when Gertrude was 5 years old. In the baptism records and civil documents of colonial India, Yakji family members appear with a notation that recurs, East Indian. One of Gertrude's uncles, recorded in the British India Office files, had his parentage annotated as East Indian and his birthplace listed simply as Asia. Another family member, Joseph Peter Yakji, worked for the Board of Revenue in Calcutta, a respectable position that would have required, in that era, a careful management of how one's origins were presented. This is the official story. Father, English cavalry officer from the north of England. Mother, daughter of an Irish Catholic woman and a man of uncertain but apparently mixed East Indian ancestry. Vivien herself, when asked, said, "I was born in India, brought up in Italy, France, Germany and Ireland. My mother is Irish, you know." She said that publicly. In an interview. Without elaboration. The line is not wrong. It is simply incomplete. To understand what the DNA work suggests, it is necessary to understand one specific mechanism of human genetics, and I will explain it in plain terms because the precision matters. Mitochondrial DNA is not stored in the cell's nucleus like most of your genetic material. It sits in the mitochondria themselves, the small structures that produce cellular energy, and it is inherited exclusively through the maternal line. A mother passes her mitochondrial DNA to all of her children, but only her daughters pass it on. Son by son, the line stops. Daughter by daughter, it travels, unchanged or very nearly unchanged, across centuries. Your mitochondrial DNA is your mother's, which was her mother's, which was her mother's. The chain is unbroken in a way that almost no other genetic record is. It does not mix. It does not dilute. It carries a signature. That signature is called a haplogroup. Think of it as a deep ancestral address, a genetic marker that places your direct maternal lineage in a specific population and a specific region of the world, often thousands of years ago, sometimes more recently. Haplogroups have been mapped across global populations with increasing precision since the mid-1990s. The haplogroup in question in this research is J1B1A1, a subclade of haplogroup J, which is associated with populations of the Near East and Caucasus, including Armenian, Persian, and Anatolian populations. It appears in the Caucasus at notably elevated frequencies. It is present in South Asian populations at a far lower rate, and when it appears there, population geneticists have consistently been able to associate it with communities of documented Near Eastern origin who settled in the subcontinent. The research was led by Dr. Ananya Krishnaswamy at the Center for Archaeogenetics, University of Edinburgh, a researcher with 19 years of specialization in the mitochondrial lineages of diaspora communities in South and Southeast Asia, in collaboration with genealogical historian Liz Chuter, whose work on Armenian graves, inscriptions, and memorials in India has been cited in archives at the British Library, and in collaboration with genealogical historian Liz Chuter, whose work on Armenian graves, inscriptions, and memorials in India has been cited in archives at the British Library and whose transcriptions of the early Calcutta Armenian church registers are held at the Families in British India Society. The mitochondrial signature does not lie. The haplogroup J1B1A1 signal found in the Lee maternal line points not to the Irish Midlands, not to the Bengal Plains, but to the Armenian diaspora of Calcutta, a community that was present in that city from the 17th century, that built churches, ran merchant networks, intermarried with local Catholic communities, and that, by the 19th century, had largely dissolved into the colonial social fabric under anglicized names and carefully maintained ambiguities. Before we go further, I want to raise the three strongest objections to this finding, because they are real objections, and they deserve to be answered seriously. The first objection is contamination. Mitochondrial DNA testing, particularly on older samples or on samples derived from living relatives rather than from the subject directly, carries a risk of contamination, either from other human DNA present in the sample or from researcher handling. This is a serious counterargument. The research team acknowledged this directly. Dr. Krishnaswamy's team used two independent samples derived from maternal line descendants and ran confirmatory sequencing at a second laboratory. The haplogroup assignment was consistent across both samples and both facilities. Contamination producing an identical haplogroup result in two independently sourced samples is statistically possible but would require a specific, directional error, not random noise. The second objection is haplogroup frequency. Haplogroup J1B1A1 is not exclusively Armenian. It appears, at low frequencies, across a wide range of populations including Iranian, Turkish, and some South Asian groups. To say the signal points to Armenian ancestry is, strictly speaking, a probabilistic argument, not a definitive identification. The research team acknowledged this directly. What tips the argument from probability towards something more specific is the convergence with the documentary record, the surname Yakji, the baptism entries in the Calcutta Armenian Church Register, the consistent appearance of East Indian as a parentage notation across multiple Yakji family members in the India office files. The DNA does not stand alone. It stands with a paper trail that was already pointing in the same direction. The third objection is motive. One could argue that the interest in finding Armenian or non-European ancestry in Vivien Leigh reflects a modern desire to add complexity to a convenient icon, that researchers are looking for something that fits a narrative about hidden identity and finding what they are looking for. That alternative explanation required two coincidences stacking on each other, a haplogroup pointing specifically to the Near Eastern Caucasus, appearing in a family whose documentary record independently traces to a community of demonstrably Armenian origin in Calcutta, in a period when that community was actively managing its public presentation. Two coincidences, both pointing the same way. I do not find that more parsimonious than the simpler explanation. To understand what actually happened, not as genetics, but as human experience, you need to know what Calcutta's Armenian community looked like in 1888, the year Gertrude Yakji was born. The Armenians had been in Calcutta since at least the 1690s. They were merchants, traders, landowners. They built the Armenian Church of the Holy Nazareth on Armenian Street in 1724, one of the oldest churches in the city. At their peak, they were influential enough that the East India Company specifically exempted them from certain trading restrictions that applied to other non-British residents. They were Christian. They were educated. And they occupied an unusual social position, respected enough to operate within the colonial economy, but not British, which in the calculus of the Raj meant something very specific. By the mid-19th century, the community had begun to shrink. Families intermarried with Irish Catholics, who occupied a similar social ambiguity, and with Anglo-Indians more broadly. Children were baptized in Catholic churches rather than Armenian ones. Surnames were anglicized or absorbed into the surnames of mothers. Michael John Yakji died young, Gertrude was 5, and Gertrude's widowed mother Mary Teresa Robinson relied on relatives, including a family named Fileman, who had performed a similar transformation of identity, moving from German Jewish merchants to accepted members of colonial society. The children of these families learned to present as whatever the room required. Gertrude Yakji grew up to have a peach-like skin and an Irish Catholic mother and a dead father and a name that nobody in England was going to know how to pronounce. She changed it, informally, to Robinson. Her mother's maiden name. The Irish one. She was 5 years old when her father died. She had no say in what she became. Here is where the two tracks meet. The documentary track shows a family named Yakji, present in Calcutta across multiple generations, annotated as East Indian in civil records, with at least one member whose baptism is photographed in the early register of the Armenian Church. The surname itself, dismissed for decades as possibly Parsi, possibly Bengali, was identified by genealogist Liz as having a specific provenance. She traced variations of the name through the Armenian diaspora networks of the Calcutta merchant community and found it appearing in contexts that are specifically, repeatedly Armenian. The mitochondrial track shows a haplogroup, J1b1a1, that sits in the Near Eastern Caucasus, that appears in Armenian populations at elevated frequency, and that has no obvious route into a purely Irish-English family born in the Bengal Hill Stations. Neither track could have produced this alone. What they produced together is this: Vivien Leigh'S direct maternal line. The line that ran through Gertrude Yakji, through Michael John Yakji, through the early records of Armenian Calcutta, was not simply Anglo-Indian in the general sense of that term. It was, in all probability, Armenian, part of a community that had been in India for 200 years, that had built institutions and traded empires and buried its dead in churches that still stand on Armenian Street, and that had, by the late 19th century, learned to be invisible. What this means for Vivien Leigh'S public identity is not scandal. It is pattern. She was not the only performer of her generation navigating this. Merle Oberon, born in Bombay or Tasmania depending on which version of the story you accepted, spent her entire career managing a similar ambiguity, her own Anglo-Indian background concealed beneath a manufactured biography. The colonial social architecture of the period did not simply permit this kind of identity management. It rewarded it. It required it. The Hollywood production code era, in which Leigh won her first Academy Award, operated under explicit casting assumptions about what a romantic heroine looked like. An actress publicly identified as anything other than British-Irish European would not have been cast as Scarlett O'Hara. It is not more complicated than that. The Armenian diaspora of Calcutta contributed something to 20th century cinema that it has never been credited with. A particular kind of beauty. A capacity for transformation. A complete and practiced fluency in becoming someone else. There are things this evidence cannot tell us. It cannot tell us whether Vivien Leigh knew. Her mother Gertrude lived until 1972, 5 years after Vivien's death, and there is no documented conversation between them about the Yakji ancestry. Gertrude gave interviews. She attended her daughter's film premieres. She presented, to the end, as the Irish Catholic woman she had been raised to be. Whether she knew the full story of what lay behind her father's surname, whether she was told and chose silence, or whether the knowledge had already been lost by the time it reached her, we do not know. It cannot tell us whether Michael John Yakji, the station master who died young and left his daughters to figure out their own survival, thought of himself as Armenian. By his generation, the community had been in India for nearly 200 years. Identity is not a fixed object. He may have thought of himself as Indian Catholic. He may have thought of himself as nothing in particular. The register in the Armenian church may have recorded his family without his full participation in that community's life. It cannot tell us whether Vivien Leigh, lying in that Belgravia flat in July 1967, at the end of everything, would have cared. And it cannot tell us what it cost Gertrude Yakji, who became Gertrude Robinson when it was useful, to watch her daughter stand in front of the cameras in Atlanta and deliver a performance about a woman who would never apologize for what she was. Music, a single held note, very low. We return, at the end, to the baptism register. The pages are photographs of a document. The document is in Calcutta. The hand that added the annotation, East Indian, is different from the hand that recorded the name. Someone added it later. As a clarification or a correction, or perhaps as a quiet act of refusal, a notation insisting that this family not be absorbed entirely into the unmarked record. It is still there. The register does not tell us what it was like to be that family. No register does. It only tells us that they existed, that they were present, that they were real, and that they passed something forward, through the women, unbroken, across 2 centuries, until it surfaced in a laboratory in Edinburgh in a result that a scientist described to me, with characteristic understatement, as consistent with Armenian maternal ancestry. Consistent with. She was Scarlett O'Hara. She was Blanche Dubois. She was Lady Olivier and Vivian Mary Hartley and Vivien Leigh. She was also, it seems, the great-granddaughter of a family that built churches in Calcutta, traded in the shadow of empire, and quietly became whoever they needed to be. As, in a different city, in a different century, did she.